The Anet A8, the sweet spot of budget printers, or should this kit be avoided at all costs? Let's take a look. I ordered my printer from GearBest for $180. Right now it seems to be retailing for around $190, but at the time of filming it had a promo bringing it down to $164. You might be able to find it cheaper on eBay, for example, although I tried eBay the first time in an attempt to get a good deal, and it wound up being a complete nightmare. I ended up receiving and eventually returning with a lot of trouble a Tron XY, which is an Anet A8 clone with less quality parts. But going back to the Anet, once you do have it in your hands, the Anet comes in a large box and is full of parts. I don't have any footage or pics of putting it together, but from a box of parts to a completed printer took about 4 hours or so. Be sure to leave an afternoon for yourself or span it out a couple of days. It did come with instructions on a micro SD card, and it comes with a micro SD card to USB adapter. I mainly followed the instructions on the SD card to put it together, although there are plenty of YouTube videos and websites that have build guides. The instructions can sometimes be a little unclear on orientation of certain parts behind others, but with logic and other sources online, you shouldn't have too much trouble. It comes with various tools, including 4 hex wrenches, 2 screwdrivers, and a snipping tool that is required for assembly. It's nice it comes with them actually, because they definitely come in handy afterwards. The snipping tool is especially nice for fixing up prints during post-processing. As far as the actual hardware on the Anet, the frame is made out of acrylic, which in my opinion gives a great aesthetic look. Although, because it is acrylic, there can be some minor quality degradation from it not being as solid as aluminum frames, which people sometimes mod this printer with. At 220 by 220 by 240 millimeters, this build space should meet most people's needs. It's honestly big. It has an aluminum build plate and has a max temperature, from my tests, of 90 degrees Celsius, and a friend who has gotten his up to 100 degrees Celsius. Plenty powerful enough for PLA. I find this to be sufficient for ABS, although I try to stick with PLA because of how long it takes to heat up the bed for ABS. Leveling the bed without modding is a truly tedious thing to do because of the fact that you have to use a screwdriver every time, but more on that later. The power supply is mounted onto the side of the printer and provides power to the control board. It has a fairly quiet fan inside, although when assembling the printer you have to strip the outlet wires to attach to the power supply. Make sure to take caution with this and have the wiring as follows. The instructions I received had the colors mixed up. Luckily nothing happened with mine and I was able to fix it, but I do know of someone else that blew out their power supply for the same reasons. The control board serves its purpose and doesn't give any room for expansion, for more motors or anything else. So if you are planning on adding an onboard dual extruder system, you'll have to get a new control board. Cable management works as intended. It comes with a plastic curly system that works for putting multiple wires in and out where needed, although it's really tedious to put on and off. So be sure to have all the wiring correct before adding your cable management system. The interface area has a screen that displays some important information and status with a 5-button menu navigation control. That sounded cooler than it actually is. The buttons feel cheap and navigating around the menu is tiresome. Because of this, I stick with always keeping it connected via USB, because it feels like I have more control and I can respond quicker in tight situations. I'll be honest, I have never used the SD card to print anything. The stepper motors are unusually strong actually. The X and Z axis are driven by a belt system that is difficult to get nice and tight after building it. It does become better once you mod it though, which leads us into what upgrades I have made to my printer that I feel are very necessary. I'll start with my belt tensioners. This is my X-axis belt tensioner, which isn't 100% work-free, although the system is much better than the zip tie way that came with the printer. The Y-axis belt tensioner is amazing. With this mod, the Y-axis can tighten and loosen as easy as twisting the knob. And this is my filament guide. It uses a bearing to roll the filament and can swivel depending on where the printhead is pulling from. This allows flexibility for filament spool placement and doesn't induce extra pulling stress on the filament feeder. Loading filament in can sometimes be long and tedious. Sometimes it's hard to tell if the old filament you cut off is still inside the extruder and blocking the new one, or whether you're just not getting at the right angle to get it in. Either way, you have to hold the spring-loaded button down, which in this case is the head of a bolt. This can become painful, but with this mod I call the thumb saver, at least you're not in pain loading it in. These bed leveling knobs make adjusting the bed much easier than using a screwdriver. However, you do have to drill out the thread from the H-bridge below. One thing that is different about my printer as well is the build surface. This specific one is called LokBuild that I bought from one of their distributors. This allows me to print PLA without heating up my bed. There are other varieties out there, but I personally have no trouble with this one. After having showed you the hardware, let's take a quick summary from the ugly to the amazing. The parts to make the printer were generally cheap, and there is always a risk associated with 3D printing, so make sure to have a smoke alarm nearby and a fire extinguisher handy. It also may be a good idea to mod the printer with various safety features for this very reason. Because the stepper motors are unusually strong, there is a potential for a pretty bad pinching hazard if you are not careful working with it while it's running. But being cautious should be a common safety practice anyway, regardless of what printer you are working with. Adding upgrades, in my opinion, is necessary to keep calibration time down and keep it running smoothly. Another negative I would put on it would be the lack of auto bed leveling. Even with the upgrades that I put on, leveling is not a super easy task and takes some tedious fine-tuning. Going along with that, as I said earlier, menu navigation isn't that good, and you'll find yourself keeping it hooked up to the computer most of the time. The printer works on a standard RepRap style and can be run with pretty much any slicing software that you wish to use. The Anet gives decent quality. These frogs here are printed at 0.3 and 0.1 millimeters. And don't worry, I'll include a link in the description to anything printed on my videos. For the pretty huge build space and the hardware that comes with the printer, this price is a pretty incredible deal. My final thoughts on this printer are this. If you are wanting to break into 3D printing on a budget, like I did, and have a good amount of build space, this printer will do the trick, but only if you are willing to put your hands in the mud and love this printer for all its little quirks. It does take time, dedication, and patience, but overall, this printer has served me well and will continue to do so.